This is the X35H. It is the latest handheld retro gaming console from PowKiddy, and it's quite a departure from their usual style in terms of its striking looks and a few improvements in performance. But the question is, does it do enough to convince you to buy one? So I've been testing out this great little handheld sent to me by Lit NXT for review for the last couple of weeks now, and it's really stood out from the crowd in terms of its design. It's pretty, it's portable, and for a budget handheld, it's pleasingly powerful. So first, let's look at the design of the console itself. Okay, so in terms of aesthetics, it has a nice symmetrical shape with lots of curves. This is quite a departure from PowKiddy's usual boxy style, and I am here for it. It's similar in size to Anbernic's Game Boy Advance clone, the RG34XX, but with a slightly larger display and a slimmed down casing that's much easier to fit in your pocket. There's a smooth matte finish to the surface that looks premium and is nice to hold. As you know, I often go for the yellow units when they're available, but in this case I was quite curious about the candy pastel buttons on the white unit, and thankfully in the flesh they really stand out against the multitude of black or DMG grey handhelds out there, and I like that. Now I appreciate this colorway is not going to be for everyone, but the design of the console is very nice and there are colorways to suit all tastes available. The thumbsticks are fine, they're there if you need them, but they're not obtrusive. They're set quite far into the casing, even though the casing is relatively slim anyway, and everything is spaced nicely around the standard 4:3 aspect ratio 3.5 inch 640 by 480 IPS display, which is fine. It's fairly bright, it performs well enough, and it looks great once you've got the game settings right. More on that later. The controls are thankfully laid out to favour the D-pad and the face buttons without getting too close to the screen. The shoulder buttons match the yellow colour of the D-pad and they look great, although I'm not convinced the placement is designed with comfort in mind. Which brings us on to the ergonomics. How comfortable is this console to actually use? Now I think this console feels really nice to hold. It's compact and comfortable. Unlike PowKiddy's usual trademark boxy offerings, this was a pleasant surprise, and it reminded me of the feel of a Sega Mega Drive controller, but flatter. It feels really solid with an excellent build quality, rounded edges. The feel reminds me of a scaled down TrimUI Smart Pro. Now this is not a bad thing at all, as the Smart Pro is just about my favourite budget handheld out there. Coincidentally, it also uses the same chipset as the TrimUI Smart Pro. It runs on the Allwinner A133 Plus, which runs at 1.8 GHz compared to PowKiddy's usual RK3566, which runs at 1.5 GHz. So in theory, it will cope better with more demanding games, but of course there is more to that than just the processor. The stereo speakers are positioned on the bottom of the console and sound just fine. Volume control is easy using a button on the top, but it seems to be one of those again that's designed for vertical handhelds, as the plus and minus are reversed, an easy thing to get used to. It's got 2 SD card slots, so loads of room for extra games. In this case, the operating system and the games were all bundled on the supplied 128GB SD card from Lit NXT. Now speaking of the OS, this is the first PowKiddy console to officially use their own PowKiddy OS. When you fire it up, you can see the interface borrows heavily from Onion OS, which you'll be familiar with from the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus, and that is an excellent operating system, so at least they are borrowing from one that is a good starting point. Now unfortunately it hasn't quite got the depth of that operating system, but as an interface I would definitely say it's not the worst I've used. It's not quite as versatile as some other ones, but it definitely in most cases allowed me to do the things I needed to do to get the games running how I wanted them. Sleep mode works just fine. You simply press the power button, it goes into sleep mode, there's a little LED lit up so you know that it's still switched on, and then when you want to bring it back on you press the power button again and it comes back to life fairly quickly. So on the main screen menu, you've got different options to choose from. You've got retro, which is all of your different game systems, and bring up the list for each individual console. Favorites, which is where you select any game you want to add to that list to make it a little bit less overwhelming and more manageable in terms of choosing your games to play. Last played, which is the games you played last. Search, which is really useful because you can find the game you want even if you aren't sure which platform it's on, and particularly because, like on a lot of these kind of systems and supplied SD cards, many ROMs on there have numbers, so finding things in alphabetical order can be quite difficult. And then you've got your settings option to set everything up to your own personal preferences. Now as far as I can tell, this console doesn't appear to have any native network capabilities, so no connecting to the internet to update the operating system, so as it is I'm just reviewing it as it turns up, and that would probably be in the state that you would have it as well. It would be nice to have OTA updates, but as it stands, the operating system is fairly decent. When you go into retro and pick any particular console, the selection screen's got box art and so on. It's fairly easy to navigate. You can go up and down on the D-pad to find your game, or you can press L and R to skip ahead through the list as you go. When in game, if you press in both of the thumbsticks, it brings up a menu, which in most cases is basic but fairly useful. The supplied SD card from Lit NXT has a fantastic selection of games for a wide variety of platforms, and as is common with these things, the big Nintendo games with Mario and so on are missing from the lists, but it's quite easy to put your own ROMs on there if you want to anyway. I always find that if the obvious choices are missing, but there's hundreds, thousands maybe, of games on there, it's quite good to just have a rummage through and maybe discover some hidden gems that you'd never played before. I quite like that aspect, so the restrictions of not having the obvious games on there isn't always a bad thing. Now, when in use in comparison to PowKiddy's V20 handheld that I was testing recently, it needs a bit of a firmer press on the D-pad. However, it is still a silicone membrane under there, and thankfully not a clicky button. And although it does need that firmer press, playing over long periods of time caused no problems, no fatigue, no discomfort. There are some issues with false diagonals, but to be honest, it's not that bad. I had a good play on Probotector on the Game Boy, and it behaved really well for intentional diagonal and horizontal and vertical inputs. Now, on the other hand, the shoulder buttons are very, very clicky. It's mainly noticeable when you're trying to scroll through the game list, as a long press doesn't work to have a continuous scroll, and you have to keep pressing as you go. Now, in terms of comfort of holding the console itself, it's mostly comfortable to hold it with my fingers resting on the raised edge on the back. If you're going to be using the shoulder buttons, you will need to adjust how you hold it. I've been playing Metroid Fusion a lot on it, and it's okay, but you have to hold it a slightly weird way to reach the L and R buttons. I feel like we need to make a change in terms of these handhelds. They always have the L and R buttons on top, because things like the Game Boy Advance always had them on top, and the PlayStation Portable and the Vita and so on. But when you look at things like modern customized Xbox, PlayStation controllers, things like the Elite or the new one for the Switch 2 Pro controller, where it's got the little buttons on the back that are remappable, I think something like that really would be nice to come in on these retro handhelds. I think to just hold it comfortably with your fingers on the back and access buttons here would be great, instead of having to kind of adjust how you hold to this kind of claw grip with your fingers on top. Maybe that's something that will come along in future. We can only hope. Thankfully, seeing as they're the ones we interact with the most on these consoles, the face buttons are fantastic. They've got a really good feel, they're a decent size, and I think they look good in these pastel colours too. So let's take a look at some of the games and some of the different platforms, see what they're like to play, and see how they look, and more importantly, how to tweak how they look, because as with most of these things, when it arrives straight out of the box, the settings, they're not ideal. Now, I had issues with running PlayStation games on the V20, which I did a video for recently. Somebody in the comments, thank you very much, told me that it is due to the emulator that's used by default. And when I changed over to use a different emulator, it is running absolutely fine on that handheld. Really strange choice to have it with an emulator that didn't work very well for default. So it was the first thing I tried out on this one. And thankfully, PlayStation is running great on this handheld. I had to rejig the buttons in the settings to get them to be in the right place, but the emulation is fine. So the default settings for all games is to stretch them to the full screen and use the HD shader, but this rarely looks good, particularly if you want that kind of retro aesthetic to your games and trying to get them to look a bit more authentic. I'm not particularly into trying to modernize them and smooth everything out. I like that pixel kind of display. Now, you can change some of this from the main game selection screen where you've got that game list. What you do is you press select and it brings up a menu, and then you go into retro setting, and then in aspect ratio you use the D-pad to change that to integer scale. Now, I'd recommend integer scale for all of these platforms, and it's just a bit of a pain that stretch the full screen is the default, but I suppose it's just like trying to show off the size of the screen or something like that. I don't know, but if you want it to look authentic, definitely go for integer scale. It's looked great on all the platforms that I've tried. Then that brings us on to shaders, which is like an overlay on the display to try and make it look a bit like the original TV or LCD screen that these games were played on. Now, although there is the option to choose the shader from the main menu screen too, it doesn't seem to have any effect and still defaults to HD, which is where it smooths out all the pixels, and it's probably the ugliest highest of all the shaders that you can choose from. So to alter this, I've found you have to do it in game. It's easy enough when you press in both of the thumbsticks. So in terms of choosing your shaders, there's a few available with different advantages. So anything that you would have played on an old 4:3 cathode ray TV like NES or Mega Drive, scan lines look good and retro on these older games. Alternatively, if you want a crisp pixel display, sharp bilinear 2x works really well. In fact, as a go-to, you could pick that for all of your consoles and they'd look good. With Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, the LCD 3X shader looks great. It puts a pixel grid overlay on it that looks very like the original screens on these consoles. It works well for Game Boy 2, but for that, I prefer the sharp bilinear 2X. You can also go for the DMG look by choosing GB palette, but I feel like the green is, I don't know, it's the wrong shade. It's a slightly bluish tint. It looks a little bit odd and also a little bit blurry, and I prefer the crisp pixel display. So giving this processor a workout, Dreamcast plays pretty decent on Soul Calibur. I didn't experience any problems with that at all. I also tried out the Atomiswave game called Dolphin Blue that can be emulated on Dreamcast, and that played great. There's so much going on such a small screen, but that was more me struggling to handle the game rather than the console. N64 is a little bit choppy on the cutscenes, but the games play all right when you get going. Now the thing with N64 is you can't seem to access the same depth of settings that you can on other platforms. When you press the two thumbsticks in, you can basically save state, load state, or exit the game, and that's it. And also when you're on the main game list, normally when you press select and it gives loads of options, with N64 you can basically delete the game and nothing else. So there's no option within Nintendo 64 to set up your display settings, your overlays. Not that I've found. Anyway, if anyone else has got this console and has worked out how to tweak the settings a bit more on N64, do let me know in the comments. Also, of course, with Nintendo 64, your Super Marios, your Mario Kart and so on are nowhere to be seen. I did have some fun playing Conker's Bad Fur Day though. Now, although you do have to change these settings for each individual game, it does thankfully remember these settings. So next time you load it up, particularly from the favorites menu, everything is set up just how you want it. And it's easy to save state and load your game state and choose which slot you're saving those in. That's all in the thumbsticks menu. And you just scroll down there, choose your save file, and it automatically loads that up and you can continue where you left off last time you were playing. Favorites is a really nice way of curating a little list of games that you'll play more frequently. It's easy to add things to your list. As you're scrolling through the main list, you just press Y, it puts a star next to it and adds it to your favorites. Another neat little shortcut I've been using a lot is if you hold select and press R, it speeds up your gameplay. Now this is excellent for getting through long opening scenes or cut scenes and so on, or grinding away on any particular time-consuming games. As I say, I've been playing Metroid Fusion a lot. If you've played that before, it's quite a long, drawn-out intro on there, and there are some cut scenes that take a little while to get through. So with this shortcut, it sped things up nicely, and I could get straight into the gameplay. It's got a decent battery with a reasonable lifespan. It charges via USB-C with no fast charging capability. It's a 3,000 milliamp hour battery compared to the 5,000 milliamp hour in the V20 that I tested recently. Obviously, it's not going to last quite as long as that one. The only problem I encountered is that the power abruptly cuts out when the battery is done without any warning, and it seems like the percentage readings aren't really accurate. I know this has been an issue with PowKiddy consoles in the past, but I was really hoping they might have sorted it out by now, especially now they're using their own custom PowKiddy OS operating system on there. On one occasion, I started playing and it displayed 23% in the menu on the top right, but the console cut out without warning just a few minutes later. There's an LED on the front that lights up when you're charging or in sleep mode, but it doesn't seem to signal a low battery. Either that or I didn't notice. Then when I charged it, I left it powered off and plugged in overnight using a USB A to C cable, and when I unplugged it and booted it up in the morning, it was only reading 86%. That said, readings aside in terms of the percentages, it does give you a decent amount of play between charges. So in general, this thing doesn't feel like a PowKiddy console as such, but it is all the better for it. It's well built, smooth and comfortable to hold. It's got nice responsive buttons, and despite having two analog sticks, these are recessed into the housing of the console and don't really get in the way when you're trying to play with the D-pad and buttons. When you do want to use the analog sticks, they're comfortable to hold and they're very responsive. It looks great, and once you've got your settings right, the games look absolutely fantastic on there. As I said earlier, in terms of budget handhelds, this actually feels quite premium. Admittedly, my colour choice does make it look like a toy, and I like that, but I think if you got it in all black, it would look like a much more premium console if that's something that bothers you. So if you want to get your hands on one of these little beauties, there is an affiliate link in the description for Lit NXT with a discount code, so you can save yourself a bit of money while you're supporting my channel. Thanks again to Lit NXT for sending me this unit for review. You can of course shop around elsewhere for the best deal for you, or even buy direct from PowKiddy. With Lit NXT, I've always found they've got excellent customer service and they provide really great quality SD cards, so I've no hesitation in terms of recommending them. Now, if this little handheld is a bit too modern looking for you, I did mention earlier the Allwinner RG34XX. Now, this is decidedly retro, and if it appeals to you and you want to know a little bit more about it, I have made a video about it. I'm going to link that up here so you can go and give that a watch. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.